The book contains several encounters between chambers and African governments that will be familiar to those who have held similar meetings. Are African governments actually capable of running these anti-malarial campaigns?
Well, big question. And right now, a very relevant one, because the malaria campaign is trying to hand off. Chambers and his people are very aware that while the campaign was very innovative in a lot of ways in that it adopted business techniques and took them to aid, it's very old-fashioned in another way in that it's rich white men coming in telling Africans what to do, which is not sustainable, and which, frankly, gets Africans' backs up and has done for 50 years and is becoming... it's getting to the point now where Africans are saying they don't want aid if that's how it's going to be delivered. So they are trying to hand off now to a new organisation called the African Leaders Malaria Alliance, which most countries in Africa have signed up to, I think about 40 or 45 or so. The leader of the alliance right now is the Tanzanian president. Paul Kagame from Rwanda is also a big noise in there. And it's the big question of the moment. Is this going to work? There is no doubt that some African governments, and the examples would be Tanzania or Ethiopia or Rwanda, are incredibly capable. Ethiopia will eradicate malaria with or without any aid at all. They have a very good health minister, and they have a very efficient health department.
But why did certain African governments that had the money not put money into that initiative? It's one thing to have this rhetoric of let's see no rich white men, but it's quite another when the moment comes to put your hand in your pocket. You actually, the Kenyan government actually said no.
Yes. Well, I think that's a legacy of half a century of aid where the West has come here wagging its fingers telling people how to live their lives. The assumption now is that if it's got anything to do with health or education, African governments won't pay because somebody else will. And actually, that's true.
So it's a disincentive.
Right, well, but that is true, not least because aid at $126 billion a year is a business. It's a contract business. And aid organisations bid to win those contracts. They are queuing up at African government's door saying, we'll run your schools for you, we'll train your doctors, we will set up this hospital, we will run this irrigation program. So all the incentives are for the Africans and for the aid groups not to unwind this. And in fact, it's been remarkable in the last 2 or 3 years, while government spending has been cut in almost every area, aid has increased. Something that's increasingly controversial in the West, but the figures are there. In 2009, aid was $119 billion. The next year it increased by 5% to $126 billion. And, I mean, this will continue. I get perhaps 10, 15 press releases a day from aid groups saying, send more money. This crisis here, this crisis here, this crisis here. It's the size of aid these days is now equivalent to half of Africa, to the output of 20 African countries. This is not charity anymore. This is giant business.
And the NGOs, in a sense, thrive on what you call a crisis as opportunity. Yes,
it's well, I mean, as I say in the book, there was the great example of that is the financial crisis, where the aid community and the development community, so the World Bank, the IMF, all the big NGOs, all the UN agencies, united in this kind of siren call saying the crisis was going to hit hardest on the poorest of the poor, and not only was this distressing from a humanitarian point of view, it was also deeply unfair because the crisis had originated in the rich world. And I, like a whole bunch of other journalists, dutifully trotted out these warnings, saying 100 million people were about to be pushed into poverty. Didn't happen.
Indeed, the reverse happened.
No. I think South Africa and Botswana went briefly into recession. The other 47 countries kept growing. At the height of the crisis, Africa was still growing by 2% a year, and by 2010 it was back to 5% a year. The poorest of the poor, the 29 low-income countries in Africa, grew by 4.6%. So it was, and worse than that, it wasn't difficult to figure out that the aid world knew that it was issuing a false warning, because it was in their own figures. When Dominic Strauss-Kahn was talking about how there was going to be such a catastrophic loss of income that civil unrest, war, famine, mass migration were likely. His own organisation, the IMF, was saying that Africa was going to grow by 4.6% that year. So, yes, I found it very hard not to conclude that the aid world sees crisis as opportunity. And that, in a sense, it's how it should be. That's how aid works. A crisis occurs and aid groups ask for money to fix it, with two provisos. One, if the crisis is actually real, and two, if aid agencies can fix it.
This brings me on to the next question, which is, does the story of this anti-malaria campaign demonstrate that resources and focus can change things, or is the story more ambiguous than that?
To me, I mean, the big lesson is that aid is a business. Start treating it like a business. Look at what happens when a businessman comes in with business techniques and runs an aid campaign. You know, he has phenomenal success. There is no campaign that's ever come close to the malaria campaign. Chambers, the level of coverage that they managed to achieve of bed nets and sprays in 2.5 years, if it is merely maintained by 2015, will save 2.5 million lives. You know, that's fantastic. That's amazing. So that's lesson number one. But since I finished the book, the other lesson is I've possibly got even more sort of critical of aid. I've discovered things about the malaria campaign that are not very pretty, but probably the worst discovery was a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the statistical backbone of the book is the official World Health Organization statistics, which show that malaria was killing 1 million people at the start of the campaign every year, and by the end of 2010, that was down to 650,000. So that, you know, they saved 350,000 lives in a little over per year in about sort of 3.5 years. A report came out 2 or 3 weeks ago saying those statistics are all wrong. Malaria in fact kills 1.2 million people a year, and the reason there's been this mistake is that the previous surveys have only counted deaths of children under 5. Well, I mean, making a mistake of 600,000 people, doubling the total of malaria deaths in the world, is pretty major, considering you have thousands of scientists around the world working on this, and tens of thousands of government bureaucrats, and it is about the biggest, most important aid campaign on the planet. So I conclude from that that a lot of time aid groups don't know what they're talking about. And the reason they don't know what they're talking about is fairly obvious. They are working in areas where there is no data, where there's often no infrastructure, where there's a language problem, where even asking people, and where there's certainly a medical problem, and asking people, did your son or daughter died of malaria, won't get you an answer because they don't know. Because all they know is someone got a fever and died. So what I have become, this isn't to denigrate aid workers, but I would appreciate if the aid world, instead of delivering these press releases and this statements of certainty all the time, this will happen, this many people will die if we don't do this, we need this much money. If one aid group just came out and said, you know, we've got a rough idea of what's going on, but only rough. It seems like more people may be dying of this thing this year. We think we may have a solution. I think people will respond to that. It speaks to the difficulty of these challenges, and reducing it to simple answers and presenting yourself as someone who's going to be able to fix people and save millions of lives sets you up for failure.